So let's look at a practical example of using inheritance. To do that, I want to look at this holding class that we did in the earlier lesson. So we have this class holding, basically represents a data structure. And then we had a function that read a bunch of data. So let's go ahead and get some data here. Okay, so we've read a portfolio. This gave us a list of these holding objects. And then one of the things that we did after that is I presented this print table function that you could use to make nicely formatted tables. It was actually kind of awesome how this worked. What you could do is do print table portfolio, and then you got to pick which attributes you wanted. So you could say name, price, for instance. And you get a table with those attributes. Here's the problem that I'm going to pose. What if I wanted to make tables in different formats? Not that, but let's say I wanted to have like an HTML table or a CSV table, or I wanted to take the data and put it in a Microsoft Excel document or something like that. All of a sudden I have this problem of how to make code extensible, how to extend the code with new features. This is a perfect opportunity to use something like inheritance. In order to do this, I want to look at this print table function for a minute. Let's just sort of study this function and see what is it doing exactly. One of the things that it's doing is it has this first part of code where it emits some table header. So that first little printing bit is essentially emitting some table headers. And then what it's doing is it's doing a for loop over some objects, and then it's emitting, I guess, a row of table data. And knowing that, one of the things that I could do is I could take those ideas and maybe put them into a class. Maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a class called table format. And in this class, I will take those two things and put them into a method. What I'm going to do is make them raise an exception, essentially. So I have like a method for headings, and I'm going to have a method for row that maybe takes in some row data. And again, I don't really know what these methods are going to do, but here's kind of the idea. Maybe I could take that print table function and make it drive a class that has those methods. Essentially, I'm taking like the algorithm of making a table and I'm moving it up into a class. So here's my thinking. I'm going to take this print table function and I'm going to recast it in a slightly different form. What I'll do is I'll make it take in a formatter as an input. And then instead of hard coding a bunch of like printing, I'll drive this formatter object. Like maybe I'll say, okay, formatter, I want you to make some headings out of the column names. And then down here, instead of having a bunch of hard-coded printing, maybe what I would do is collect the data. I would say, okay, why don't you give me, I'm going to do this attribute thing. Like give me the attributes, like that. And then maybe go ahead and move that over to like the formatter as well. So the idea is I'm taking like all of this printing stuff out. Okay, I'm getting rid of that, moving it over into a class. The idea on this is that the print table function, you're going to give it a formatter. Formatter needs to have headings. It needs to have row on it. Maybe I can use this table formatter class as kind of like a starting point for using inheritance, basically. What's going to happen is this table formatter, in some sense, is serving as like a design specification. It's like a design spec for making tables. What you do is you use inheritance to customize it. Here's how that's going to work. Let's say I wanted to make like plain text tables. What I could do is make a class, text table formatter, that inherits from table formatter. And then what I will do is implement the required method. We'll do this in a second here. So the idea is I'm going to implement these two methods. Again, this is using this idea of inheritance where you can take a class and change the methods if you want. So what I'll do is I'll take this original output code that I had up here. Maybe I'll just cut and paste it. I'm going to move it into a class here. So, so I'll say headers, for instance. I don't necessarily want it to be tied to like that column name thing. We'll go ahead and format that and print. And then maybe I'll do the same thing for this row method. The code is going to be very similar here. So maybe, item in row data, format item. Okay, so I've taken like the output code, moved it into a class, and I've modified this function that I have up here to now work with one of these formatter objects. I'm going to pass in an extra object, and I'm going to drive that. Okay, let's actually see if that works. Here's the idea on it. If I have this portfolio of holding objects, I could import table. I would now make a formatter Like I could say, make a text table formatter object. And then I'm going to hand that off to the print table. So I would say, print table portfolio, maybe names, shares, price. And then I'm going to hand it a formatter to make the output. There we're back to where we started with, essentially. You can pass in a formatter, use that to make different outputs. To make different outputs, this is where it gets useful. You can start making other classes that inherit from table formatter and then do different things. Like for CSV, for instance, I could maybe make some output where I'm joining the headers together on comma, for instance. Same thing for the row data here. Okay, so maybe I have a different implementation of those methods for comma separated values. I might even do something similar for maybe like an HTML table. This is probably not the real world way you would want to do like an HTML table, but the idea though is you could have a headings method, and maybe in here you have some custom output for HTML. This is suddenly going to get really, really horrible in a hurry here for that, but you get the idea. So I have a custom method for that. We can probably adapt that pretty easily for the row method here. Just changing some of the tags a little bit here. So what we get is we're kind of building up classes that inherit from table formatter. And then what I can do is use those to make different outputs. Like I could say formatter is equal to table CSV table formatter. And then I could use that with my print table function. Like say print table portfolio name shares with that formatter. And then we get comma separated values. If I didn't want comma separated values, I could change the formatter over to an HTML table formatter. And then do the same thing, and all of a sudden I'm getting like output in that format. Looks like I've got a little typo in the code, but you did see it fire at least. Now let's just make sure it actually works here. Okay. We'll import table and then retry that same thing that I just did here. Now you're getting output in HTML. This is really, I think, actually the big idea on a lot of inheritance, actually. I mean, if you're using inheritance, you really should be thinking about like code reuse or code extensibility. And you can write, applications that take advantage of this. I mean, essentially, I've made a function that prints tables. That function is no longer tied to just doing things in one output. What I've done is I've moved that output code into a class, and then I've modified the function to kind of drive that class. Where inheritance enters the picture is this top-level table formatter, again, kind of serves as a design spec. It's sort of defining what you need to program to make a new table output. And then you can have different classes that inherit from that and then implement the methods as you see fit. So that's the general idea. There actually are a number of things that can go wrong and can be tricky about this, and we'll talk about those in the next section.